Hey everyone, so based off of my last several videos, it's clear that I'm on a diversity kick, a diversity crave, a diversity march or marathon, or whatever term you want to use. It's clear that diversity, especially on Big Brother, has been on my mind a lot, and this video is going to discuss the diversity quota that was put in place 2 years ago and whether it has been successful or not. And this is going to be the first time I ever address Survivor, so that's definitely something new and refreshing. So, on November of 2020, CBS has put a casting quota for all of their reality TV programming, following BB Can 9 and what Global did over there after Arisa Cox got promoted, to have at least 50% of their casts for their reality TV programming to be people of color. This came into place after the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Survivor alumni coming together to pitch for better diversity in CBS after they discussed their experiences on the show being Black people and how that positively or negatively infected them, whether it's on the show, by the fan base, by production, the network, so on and so forth. We have had a few seasons of Big Brother, Survivor, and a season of The Amazing Race to see the results of this, and I want to discuss whether it's been successful or not. This has caused some controversy for some people, but it also caused for some much needed diversity that was missing in their shows and some tough conversations that were shown on a national scale and that needed to happen. So before we get into the meat of it, we have to get the definition of what a person of color is and the historical content behind it. I'm going to read a few definitions of this. So we're going to talk about the Wikipedia definition first. So the term person of color, which is abbreviated for POC, is primarily used to describe any person who is not considered white in the US, but since the 2010s, it has been adopted elsewhere in the Anglosphere, like the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Ireland, South Africa, and Singapore. In the United States, people of color include African Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islander Americans, multiracial Americans, and some Latino Americans. The term, as used in the United States, emphasizes common experiences of systematic racism which some communities have faced. So just from this definition, it is clear that they are defining person of color based on what is not white and whether you have faced discrimination based off of race, whether it's systematic, physical, or otherwise. So now I'm going to read off another definition of a person of color, and this time I'm going to use Merriam-Webster. So their definition of a person of color is a person whose skin pigmentation is other than and especially darker than what is considered characteristic of people typically defined as white. It is also seen as a person who is of a race other than white or who is of mixed race. So once again, they're defining a person of color based off of what is not white. But they did mention skin pigmentation a lot in this, and it's being darker, so that's interesting. And I like that they included the mixed race. So this is clearly a different definition, though a different branch of the same definition, if it actually makes sense. So now that I discussed two definitions of what a person of color is, now I'm going to discuss two definitions of what white is, and I'm going to use Wikipedia and Merriam-Webster for those definitions. So, according to Wikipedia, white is a radicalized classification of people and a skin color specifier, generally used for people of European origin. Description of populations as white in reference to their skin color predates this notion and is occasionally found in Greco-Roman, ethnography, and other ancient or medieval sources, but these societies did not have any notion of a white or a pan-European race. The term white race or white people, defined by their light skin amongst other physical characteristics, entered the major European languages in the late 17th century when the concept of a unified white achieved universal acceptance in Europe in the context of racialized slavery and unequal social status in European colonies. Scholarship on race distinguishes the modern concept from pre-modern descriptions, which focused on physical complexion rather than race. Prior to the modern era, no European peoples regarded themselves as white, but rather defined their race, ancestry, or ethnicity in terms of their nationality. So there's a lot to pack in here, and I don't know if I'm going to get into all of it. But white is mainly defined here as being European. And I like that they also discussed that they created the white race to essentially justify slavery that was happening in the Caribbean, in the Americans, and in Asian colonies. So it's essentially creating this ideal to judge people who they saw as less than based off of what they created as a race to justify why they are using them as slaves and why they, the white people, don't need to be slaves and why they feel like they have the right to own these people as slaves. It also talked about how before modern times, people define themselves based off their nationality over anything else. So now I'm going to discuss white people based off the definition of Merriam-Webster. So, according to Merriam-Webster, the definition of white pertaining race is of or relating to any of various population groups considered as having light pigmentation of the skin. There's another note in the bottom. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read a majority of it. So it says, the meaning of white as it relates to population groups has historically been fluid, with people of particular ancestries being excluded for a time before being included and vice versa. The category has often functioned as a grouping into which people who are not designated as belonging in some other category are placed. So there's quite a bit to pack into this definition. So it addresses that what is considered white changes as the centuries and as society evolves or devolves, as certain groups of people weren't considered white in the past but are considered now, and there are people who were considered white in the past but who aren't now. It just shows how socially constructed all of this is. And it also briefly touched upon how some people will be grouped into white since they can't be grouped into any other category. So that's interesting, and I'll delve more into that when I discuss the legal definition of white in the US based off the US Census. The United States Census Bureau defines white people to be those having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Within official census definitions, people of all racial categories may be further divided into those who identify as non-Hispanic or Latino and those who do identify as Hispanic or Latino. The term non-Hispanic white, rather than just white, may be the census group corresponding mostly closely to those persons who identify as and are perceived to be white. In the United States, the term white people generally denotes a person of European ancestry, but has been legally extended to people of West Asian and North African, so Middle Eastern, West Asian, and North African ancestry. Other persons who are classified as white by the US Census, but may or may not identify as or be perceived as white includes Arab Americans and Jewish Americans. In 2015, the Census Bureau announced their intention to make Hispanic/Latino a racial category, similar to white or black, with correspondents being able to choose one, two, or more racial categories. In 2015, the US Census endorsed the idea of creating a separate racial category for Middle Eastern and North African Americans in the 2020 census. For both groups, the plan was discarded when the Trump administration came into power. So there's quite a lot to break down here. I mentioned earlier that the definition of white involves people of European descent, but according to the US, it involves people of European, Western Asian, and North African descent. And even in the definition that I read about this, according to the census, it mentions that Middle Eastern and North African people are legally considered white, but they added the legal part because it seems like they aren't perceived to be white by most people just in society. So there's a distinction between them and being European. It also discussed making the distinction between Hispanic and Latino or non-Hispanic and Latino, since there's a lot of Hispanic or Latino people in the US, and some of them do or do not identify as white. So they divided the categories just so they can pinpoint who is Latino or Hispanic. With the push to have Middle Eastern, West Asian, and North African, as well as Hispanic or Latino people to be a racial category in the census, which has been pushed since the last several decades, but pushed heavily since 2015, but it was shut down. So it's clear that these two groups want to be represented properly in the census, especially since they most likely don't see themselves as white on average, or they feel like they receive a different treatment compared to European whites. This is important because we're going to see how this translates into how CBS casts not only Europeans, but Western Asian and North Africans, and Hispanic/Latino people, since all three of them are under the white label in the US, but they aren't treated as such according to CBS casting. So I'm going to read more definitions of other racial groups just so we can have a clear definition to pinpoint what is what and who is what, and so we can use this to dig deeper into how these racial categories affect the shows that we watch under CBS reality TV. Asian Americans are Americans of Asian ancestry. Although this term had historically been used for all indigenous peoples of the continent of Asia, the usage of the term Asian by the United States Census Bureau only includes people with origins or ancestry from the Far East, so East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, so South India, and excludes people with ethnic origins in certain parts of Asia, including West Asia, who are now categorized as Middle Eastern Americans. Those with origins from Central Asia, so the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turkmens, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, hopefully I said that correctly, Afghans, etc., are not mentioned in racial definitions provided by the United States Census Bureau. This is clearly problematic in so many ways. So they're lumping East, Southeast, and South Asians together under the census when there are so many differences between those groups, especially South Asians and Southeast and East Asians. They didn't count Western Asians for whatever reasons they didn't count them, though I'm pretty sure there are other historical reasons. And they didn't even, they literally forgot about Central Asians. How do you forget about a specific group of people who are under the continent of Asia? How does that even make sense? And the fact that you didn't even address them in the census? Clearly, this is one of the many reasons why so many people think that the census is a bunch of BS. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, Asian person in the United States is most often thought of as a person of East Asian descent. So, despite the definition that's given, people generally see Asian, at least in America, as East Asian compared to Southeast Asian, South Asian, so on and so forth. In vernacular usage, Asian is usually used to refer to those of East Asian descent or anyone else of Asian descent with epicanthic eye folds. So pretty much saying that anyone with a certain type of eye frame are Asian. This differs from the US definition, and the Asian American Studies Department in many universities considers all of those of East, South, or Southeast Asian descent to be Asian. If you go to other countries like the UK, they consider Asian people to mainly be South Asian people. So it also depends on the location, where they have different definitions of who is Asian. And even in what I just read, the US isn't even sure about who they consider to be as Asian based off their legal definitions and the sociological treatment of who people identify as Asian in everyday, day-to-day life. Prior to there being an Asian category in the 1980s that they could be included under, many Americans of South Asian descent usually classified themselves as Caucasian or other. Changing patterns of immigration and an extensive period of exclusion of Asian immigrants have resulted in demographic changes that have in turn affected the formal and common understandings of what defines Asian American. So now I'm going to read the different types of Asian Americans that fit under this category according to the census and break down who fits in each of those categories. So East Asian Americans are Americans of East Asian descent which come from Eastern Asia. So this includes the Chinese, Hong Kong, Japanese, Korean, Macanese, Mongolian, Ryukyuan, hopefully I said that correctly, Taiwanese, Tibetan, and Uyghurs. South Asian Americans are people of American descent who comes from South Asia, which is in the southern areas of Asia. This includes Bangladeshis, Bhutanese, Indians, Indo-Caribbean Americans, so people who are of Indian descent that live in Guyana, Trinidad, even Jamaica, so on and so forth. Indo-Fijian Americans, same thing, people of Indian descent who live in Fiji. Maldivians, Nepalese, Pakistani, and Sri Lankans. Southeast Asian Americans are Americans who come from Southeast Asia and have ancestral ties to the Southeast Asian countries. So this includes Koreans, Burmese, Cambodians, Filipinos, Hmongs, Indonesians, Lumians, Karens, Laotians, Malaysians, Singaporeans, Thais, Timorese, and Vietnamese. I could go on and on about the controversy of who is considered Asian and why many of these separate groups shouldn't be grouped together, but I'll be here forever. And I need to discuss other definitions of certain racial groups, like what is African Americans, or Black Americans, or Afro Americans. African Americans, also referred to as Black Americans and Afro Americans, are an ethnic group consisting of Americans with partial or total ancestry from sub-Saharan Africa. The term African American generally denotes descendants of enslaved Africans who are from the United States. While some Black immigrants or their children may also come to identify as African American, the majority of the first-generation immigrants do not, preferring to identify with their nation of origin. That's also like a lot of white people who are in their countries. They tend to identify with their nationalities. So it's interesting that these two racial groups have that in common. African Americans constitute the second largest racial group in the US after white Americans, as well as the third largest ethnic group after Hispanic and Latino Americans. Most African Americans are descendants of enslaved people within the boundaries of the present United States. According to the US Census Bureau data, African immigrants, so people who come to the States from Africa, generally do not self-identify as African American. The overwhelming majority of African immigrants identify instead with their own respective ethnicities, so 95% of them actually. Immigrants from some Caribbean and the Latin American nations and their descendants may or may not also identify or self-identify with that term. So within the diaspora, there are African Americans, so ADOS, African descendants of slavery. There are Caribbean people, or Afro-Caribbean people, so Black people who live in the Caribbean. This can also include some Latin Americans. There are also Black Latinos, or Black Latin Americans, but we'll delve into that in the next section that involves them. And then there are, of course, Africans who aren't no Africans. So sub-Saharan African, though I don't like that term, but that's generally the term that academia likes to use. So people from Africa who aren't from North Africa, essentially. Middle Eastern Americans are Americans of Middle Eastern background. According to the United States Census Bureau, the term Middle Eastern American applies to anyone of West Asian or North African origin. This includes people whose background is from various Middle Eastern and West Asian ethnic groups, such as the Kurds and Assyrians, as well as immigrants from modern-day countries of the Arab world, Iran, Israel, Turkey, and sometimes Armenia. Although once called Asian Americans, the modern definition of Asian American now excludes people with West Asian backgrounds. So another example of how these racial categorizations and definitions of such aren't even consistent and can change like that. In the early 20th century, there were many cases where people of Arab descent were denied entry into the United States or were deported because they were categorized as non-white. In 1944, the law changed and Middle Eastern and North African peoples were granted white status, though that was obviously only on paper, which we have seen in the years since. And CBS certainly agrees with that as well. Latin Americans are the citizens of Latin American countries, or people with cultural, ancestral, or national origins in Latin America. Latin American countries and their diasporas are multi-ethnic and multiracial. As a result, some Latin Americans do not take their nationality as an ethnicity, but identify themselves with a combination of their nationality, ethnicity, and their ancestral origins. Aside from the indigenous Amerindian population, all Latin Americans have some Old World ancestors who arrived since 1492. Latin America has the largest diasporas of Spaniards, Portuguese, Africans, Italians, Lebanese, and Japanese in the world, while having a large German, second largest after the United States, French, Palestinian, largest outside the Arab states, Chinese, and Jewish diasporas. Many have a predominance of European Amerindian or Mestizo ancestry. Others are primarily mulatto, which is a mix of black and white. Various Black, African, Asian, Zambo, which is mixed Black and Amerindian, minorities are also identified in most countries. The largest single group are white Latin Americans. Together with the people or part European ancestry, they combine for almost the totality of the population. In the US Census documents, the designation white overlaps, as do all other racial categories, with the term Hispanic or Latino, which was introduced in the 1980 census as a category of ethnicity, separate and independent of race. Hispanic and Latino Americans as a whole make up a racially diverse group as a whole, are the largest minority in the country. So this will be interesting because if you look at Big Brother US casting, they didn't capture the diversity of the area until very recently. And even still, there are a lot of people who are a part of the Latin diaspora who are excluded. So the final group I want to discuss are Pacific Island Americans, though I believe there's only one person in BBUS history who falls under that category, and even still, they were mixed. So, Pacific Islander Americans, also known as Oceanian Americans, are Americans who are of Pacific Islander ancestry or descendants of the indigenous peoples of Oceania or of Austronesian descent. For its purposes, the United States Census also counts indigenous Australians as a part of this group. So now that I got all the definitions, terms, and all that jazz out of the way, now it's time to talk about the data. So I went through a list of several of the most recent Big Brother seasons and dividing them into two, whereas I'm going to look at the casts based off of the last 6 seasons pre-diversity quota, so from Big Brother 17 to Big Brother 22, and the second group will be Big Brother casts post-quota, so Big Brother 23 and Big Brother 24. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide them into the racial/ethnic categories that I discussed earlier, and then I'm going to divide them by the amount of seasons that are in each category. So I'll have an average median for each ethnic or racial group based off of the average of there being representation for that group in a specific season, based off the two categories that I discussed, pre-quota and post-quota. So, for whatever ethnic or racial group I'm talking about, post-quota, I'm going to add the amount of house guests that represents that group in the post-quota era, and then divide it by 2, since there are only 2 seasons in that era. And for the pre-quota, I'm going to add all the amount of people in that ethnic or racial group, and then divided by 6, since I'm looking at the last 6 seasons before the quota came into play. Also, if a person is biracial or bi-ethnic, and they fit into 2 of these categories, I'm going to put them in both. So by the end of this, I'm going to compare the 2 eras to see whether the quota helped a specific group have more representation, or did they actually suffer from it, or if there's been no improvement whatsoever. If a house guest played more than once during this era, I'm counting each of their durations as separate. So the first group I'm going to discuss are Black house guests, and just from the numbers, it is clear that the African American/Black house guests benefited the most from the diversity quota, to the pleasure and chagrin of several people. Before the quota, within the last 6 seasons, the average median of house guests per season was 2.33. Average median since the diversity quota rose over twice the amount, as the average is now 5.5 house guests. What this tally means is that they have went out of their way to cast twice the amount of Black people on average in the last 2 seasons of Big Brother compared to the last 6 seasons before the quota was put into place. We clearly see how this changed things, since Black allegiance has come up for better or worse in both seasons, and since the quota was put into place, there have been 2 Black winners where there was none before the quota whatsoever. It showed the diversity of Black house guests and Black people in general, where in the past they would cast either 1 or 2 stereotypical tropes that the token Black house guest or house guests, if there was more than one in general, to fit in, and within these last 2 seasons, you are able to see that not all Black people are the same. So now we are going to move on to the Latino house guests, and it isn't shocking that the Latin American house guests benefited the second most from the diversity quota, and in the United States, Latino people are the largest ethnic minorities, not racial, since it isn't a race. Before the diversity quota came into place, the average Latin house guest in a Big Brother season was 1.83, and since the quota, the average person in a BB season of Latino descent is 3. What's interesting about this result is that it would have been a lot lower, since Big Brother 23 only had 2 people of Latin descent, and Big Brother 24 had 4 people with Latin descent. And just from looking at the people from the last 2 seasons, all of them but one is mixed either with another race or another ethnicity. So some are half Latino, half Black, half Latino, half Asian, or half Latino and half non-Latin white. The fact that most of them are either half non-white Latin and the Latin side is also most likely white or mixed is kind of problematic, meaning they still don't care to cast indigenous Latino people. A few of the Latinos within the last 2 seasons are Afro-Latinos, which is nice to see since they were not cast until a few years before the quota in general. Despite everything, they have made an increasing effort to cast more Latino people since the diversity quota. There sadly isn't much to discuss pertaining the numbers of Western Asian and North African house guests, whether it is pre-diversity quota or post-diversity quota. The ratio before the quota was at a dismal 0.67 average per season, meaning that the average is less than one Middle Eastern, West Asian, or North African person per season, and since the diversity quota, it actually decreased, with the average being 0.5. And we know this would have been a zero had there not been a last minute casting change in Big Brother 24, where the Middle Eastern house guest was an alternate for a black house guest. Even with that in mind, it just shows that casting doesn't see Western Asian and North African house guests as white, despite what the census says. In general, this is just inexcusable with the poor representation, and they need to do better with casting more Western Asian and North African house guests in general. Diversity isn't just about casting from two groups. For some reason, I decided to group East and Southeast Asian house guests together, and I think it's partially due to the whole controversial idea of what quote unquote Asian is, but no matter what, the East and Southeast Asians are always included in what is Asian, essentially. The average median before the diversity quota is 1.17, and like the Western Asian North Africans, the ratio decreased once the diversity quota was put into place, where the average median is now just 1. It is really inexcusable, since they are both racial and ethnic minorities, and the East as well as Southeast Asian populations keep on growing in the United States, with their own successful media being implemented in the country, but Big Brother isn't taking part in it. They need to put a lot more effort here and not just milk Derek X for all he's worth. And while it's great that he's representing East Asians, there needs to be more than just him. And the final group that is going to be discussed are the South Asian house guests, and the numbers are astronomically low, but that is mainly because they didn't start casting South Asian house guests until literally 4 years ago from the dates that I'm recording this. Meaning that there were 19 seasons and about 18 years where there were no South Asian house guests in Big Brother ever. With this in mind, the increased median post-quota is very misleading, with a median of 0.5 post-quota where the median was 0.33 before the diversity quota. Things only increased due to the smaller amount of seasons in the quota era. It is also problematic that they have only cast one monoracial South Asian person in 23 seasons, as the others are biracial. Treacherous like the other two groups that I've mentioned. Now it is time for me to do the same thing with Survivor, post-quota and pre-quota, and this is the first time on my channel ever that I've discussed Survivor, though I've watched every season with the exception of the second half of 39. But yeah, this is exciting for me because I never discussed Survivor on this channel, and this is my first time ever discussing it in any sort of capacity. So I could have waited until the yearly cycle for the 2022 filmed season was completed, meaning I could have done this at like the end of May, early June 2023, but I simply put didn't want to wait that long. Unshockingly, things panned out differently for Survivor post-diversity quota than Big Brother, but we will break it all down. Since it was actually the Black Survivor alumni who actually propositioned CBS to implement this quota, it should not be shocking to anyone that it has benefited African American / Black Survivor castaways the most. Before the quota, the average amount of Black Survivor players per season was 2.7, which has more than doubled, with the average now being 5.33 per season. This is close to Big Brother's average, which is 5.5. While it is great that there are a lot more Black survivors, you will see that the average for them is more than double in comparison to everyone else. And CBS tends to think that more diversity solely means more Black people, when that's not the case. Some improvements definitely need to be made, but we will discuss them more in more depth once we get to the other groups. The next group of people we are going to discuss are Latin American survivor castaways, since they are the second most populous just based on how CBS casts their reality shows. The average per season for Latin American castaways before the quota was 1.4. And since the diversity quota was put into place, the average has almost doubled, since the average per season now is 2.67. Since it's an ethnic group instead of a racial group, you would think that we would see many different types of Latino castaways, but that's not necessarily the case. A majority of them are white Latinos, and some of them are mestizo Latinos, with there only really being one Afro Latino on this list overall. Once again, there are no indigenous Latinos or even Asian or Arab Latinos, where there were in the past, but with the diversity quota put in place, it is not as lopsided for one group of Latinos like it is for Big Brother. The average is a bit smaller compared to Big Brother's, which had an average of 3 post-quota. So we are going to move on to discussing the Middle Eastern / Western Asian and North African survivor castaways, and they have generally been a very underrepresented group in the history of Survivor, but nowhere near as bad as Big Brother, who only has 4 up to this date. The average median per season before the diversity quota was put into place was 0.4, meaning less than 1 person per season, and with the quota put into place, it is now 0.67. It is an improvement, especially compared to Big Brother, which decreased, but barely improved in general. And it just continues to perpetuate their lack of visibility in the media overall, and the average is still less than 1. What I noticed is that the Middle Eastern, West Asian, and North African castaways in Survivor and the last 10 seasons before the quota was put into place, a lot of them are closer to white leaning or white passing Arabs, while in Big Brother, they are very brown skinned and have a lot more Asiatic features. So that was interesting to notice. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that for pre-diversity quota, I'm looking at the past 10 seasons. So I'm going down to Survivor Cambodia, so season 30. Now it is time to discuss the East and Southeast Asian Survivor castaways, and I already discussed prior why I'm combining the two groups for the sake of this video. Before the quota, the average median for an East or Southeast Asian person to be on Survivor was 1.4, but it has now moved up to 2.33. What's very interesting about this to me is that unlike Big Brother, the number rose where it decreased in Big Brother, and it has the same rate as the Latino castaways post-quota. It is weird that one show clearly prioritizes having this race represented a lot more on their CBS show, while the other show clearly doesn't put that same effort. Maybe it's just the issue of the production company, but even then, it's CBS who approves the cast for both shows and to finalize them, so I don't really get this huge dichotomy between Survivor and Big Brother pertaining the representation of East and Southeast Asian reality stars. And the final group of people I'm looking into pertaining racial / ethnic representation are the South Asian Survivor castaways. Before the diversity quota, the average per season pertaining South Asian representation was 0.2, meaning that they were the group that had the least representation within the last 10 seasons, where it did rise to 0.6 with the quota put into place, which, while it is an improvement, it is a menial and weak improvement. CBS overall clearly is just not putting much effort at all in either show to have much South Asian representation. And it shouldn't be surprising, since even during the 2006 filming cycle, when they wanted to have more representation in Survivor Cook Island and Survivor Fiji, they left South Asian people out, in addition to leaving out the Western Asian North African people out entirely.